what I'm going to show you today are examples of marker types, architectural styles, and motifs. And we'll talk about symbolism of some of the most common motifs in categories like fraternal and religion and figures. The markers and cemeteries vary by region and time period. We'll find many of the markers, types, and motifs that I talk about later when we go to Oak Grove Cemetery. Now, I use the term grave marker because tombstone connotes stone, which is not always the case. Most of the type categories I use are based on Harold Meitom's recording and analyzing graveyards. In different parts of the country, the names may be different. This Boston cemetery has some of the oldest extant markers in the U.S. They range from the early 1600s to the early 1800s, and about 99% of them are tablets. And here are some examples at the bottom from Hadley, Massachusetts, and the top, Columbia, Tennessee, about a century apart in time period. Another type is ledger and low monument. Ledgers are flat slabs on the ground that can be stone or concrete. These are low monuments. They're basically raised ledger stones. And sometimes they have a roof-like gable like this one at the top. And these are also called low monuments, even though they have what appears to be a roof. They have cross gable configurations, and then one on the right is just a plain gable like a roof you see on a house. Victorian flower boxes are considered low monument types. Those side rails are called curbs. Then we have boulder and rock. Now, a lot of times you may see uncarved, unfinished field stones placed out of economic necessity to mark a grave. They could be considered this type, but what I'm really talking about here are ones that were purchased and inscribed to place on a grave, such as this one. And this is not part of the ground. This was an actual boulder that was moved to this location to mark the grave. And here's another one that was moved, some actual polished stone. The marker on the left is not what's called a boulder style. It's a block of granite that was just carved to look like rustic stone. It's called rusticated. The one on the right has a carved face in the shape of a scroll, but the rest of the stone is left unmarked, so that's still considered a boulder or rock type. Now here we're talking about two types, chest and table, and these reflect the furniture that they're named for. Some people, however, call these box tombs. These are box tombs. They're actually false crypts because the body's buried in the ground, and these structures are on top of the ground just to protect it from marauding animals and so forth. This chest tomb is carved in decorations similar to what you might see on hope chest made of wood. A lot of the decorations you see came from their wood counterparts, the furniture counterparts. These are table tombs. They look like a table. Now this type is actually my term. Bed, coffin, and sarcophagus. The sarcophagi are not original Egyptian definition because the bodies were never buried in the ones I'm going to show you. This is what I call a bed type. It dates to the mid-1800s. Now if you notice, the cover is actually carved to look like a crocheted bedspread. And what looks like a headboard has the name and death date and so forth. And some people classify these as low monument types. This bed has cover and a pillow. The pillow is actually called a bolster. It could also be considered a variation of a chest tomb. And this is a coffin marker because it's shaped like a coffin. And this is what I call a sarcophagus marker. It has elaborate decoration and the boxy shape reminiscent of Greco-Roman design and Egyptian type structures that we used to house bodies. A desk and wedge shapes are just real familiar. They're easy to recognize. This has a scroll on top, but obviously it's shaped like a wedge. And these are desk types, easy to recognize. It looks just like a book up on a desk or a scroll up on a desk. Now, pedestals sometimes don't fit what we think of when we say the term pedestal. Some look like blocks. Some have elements on top, like urns or lamps or drapery or statuary. The one on the left is what's called a cuboid pedestal. It's commonly called a block. The one on the right is a pedestal topped with an urn. And you may notice this is sort of an unusual color. This is metal. It's cast zinc, also known as white bronze. They're colored, real easy to identify in a cemetery. They're no longer manufactured. They were only made for about 30 to 40 years in the late 1800s, early 1900s. On the left, the pedestal is topped with a grape and an open book. On the right, it's sometimes called a truncated obelisk because it follows the obelisk shape about halfway up, and then it cuts off and an urn is put on top. On the left, it's called a vaulted obelisk. And again, it looks like it started out to be an obelisk and somebody got tired and cut it off. And it's shaped in a cross form at the top, not counting that urn that's on top. But the cross form and arch symbolizes a temple or a church vaulted ceiling. And then on the right are two obelisks, a plain one in the background, and then in the front foreground is one that's topped with a drape. A broken column, like the one on the left, is a pedestal type. And on the right is called a pilaster column. That's also a pedestal. Now, another type is the cross. We typically think of crosses as religious symbols, but some are more indicative of ethnic background than religion. Now, a prime example is the one on the left. That's a Celtic cross. That's normally on the graves of people with Scots-Irish heritage. On the right is a Latin cross, and that's normally seen in a religious context. On the left is an Ionic cross. It has the ring like a Celtic cross, but the arms you see flare out toward the ends, and that's called an expanded terminal. The two on the right are barely recognizable as crosses. That's called a botany cross. The ends look like clubs or what's called a trefoil. On the left is a fleuret or Gothic cross, and sometimes called a fleur-de-lis. On the right is the Eastern cross used in Russian and Greek Orthodox religions. There's several other names for that we'll get to later. Logs, stumps, and trees. Now, I know around here you have lots of woodmen of the world markers. And there's a big misconception in some parts of the country about those. There are stumps and logs and tree markers that are not woodmen of the world. And we'll go more into that in the symbolism section. On the right, that particular stump has mushrooms on top and a blooming vine around the bottom. Now, these may look like elephant feet, but they're not. They're huge tree stumps, one for each family member surrounding that obelisk in the center of their plot. And this is the biggest tree marker I've ever seen. There's a woodpecker up at the top and a book above the burl, and the wedge, splitting wedge and axe are hands of the book open. And then sculpture. Now, sculpture markers can be freestanding or incorporated into plain bases or frames. The one on the left is a separately carved piece from the rest of the marker. And on the right, it's physically attached at the base to the rest of the marker, but it appears to have been cut from a separate block of marble. And this bronze sculpture is mounted in a granite frame. The deer on the left is mounted on the base. The woman on the right and the cross are carved from the same piece of marble. Now we'll talk about tumulus types and mausolea. A tumulus marker dates back to ancient times and is used around the world. It's akin to the Native American mound building culture. In the U.S., it's typically used for deceased who descend from Celtic areas. And mausolea are usually designed by architects. This is a tumulus. It's a mound of earth, sometimes with stones. It usually has one or more graves. They're also called barrows or burial mounds or kurgans. If the mound is primarily of stones, it's called a cairn, C-A-I-R-N. Now some have masonry entrances like this one, and this was actually probably the cemetery's death house, or a place where bodies were kept until weather conditions would allow grave digging. It has a date but no name. That's why I think it was not a family mausoleum, tumulus. Now mausoleums or mausolea rather, are freestanding buildings that contain the bodies of the deceased, usually in blocks in the wall. Sometimes they're in the floor. Now we'll go quickly through architectural styles. Colonial, the oldest ones, markers with skulls are usually older than ones with faces. The one up at the top left has a face, what we might call a stick face. So, it's a little newer than the skull. And these are both mid-1700s. Now skulls gave way to what are called winged faces, like the one on the left. The one on the far right then was a little bit later version that's called a portrait stone. Then we get into the Neoclassical period. About the time of the American Revolution, we wanted to associate ourselves with older cultural ideals, so we turned to design elements from the ancient classics. So from the mid-1700s or so through the mid-1800s, grave markers reflected the affinity for classical design elements like bases and swags and festoons and figures carved from figures and busts carved in low relief. And this drapery you see on the marker on the right, as well as the willow and urn, are also classical symbols. Then we got to Egyptian Revival. After Napoleon's 1798-99 forays into Egypt, all things Egyptian became the craze, even in cemeteries. And then the fad occurred again every time there was a major discovery, such as the excavation of King Tut's tomb. This tumulus was built in 1800. These obelisks and pyramid-topped pedestals date to the 1840s. These are in New York. On the left, the draped pyramid pedestal element on the top of that tablet marker is Egyptian Revival. That's 1820. And the mausoleum on the right is topped with an obelisk, and it's about 1850. Now this is Egyptian Revival tumulus. It has the typical facade shape like the entrance to a pharaoh's tomb. The doorway has this lashed edging like bundled papyrus stalks. Then we get to Classical Revival. About the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, this was popular style. And elements to note during this period, the classic urn, the weeping willow, and the lotus blossoms. That row right there, those are stylized lotus blossoms. And then the drapery on the obelisk. And this draped urn is one of the most ubiquitous of the Classical Revival grave marker interpretations. This is considered a gateway or bicolumnar monument, and it supports an arch that's made to look like a church. Now also the columns are topped with Corinthian capitals, and then these shell objects here are all classical design elements. And here's some of the same elements in a different type marker. You see the large shell behind the bust, columns topped with Corinthian capitals, the casket, the woman in draped mourning clothing. And another popular fad at the time was anything that looked like remains of old structures, even in grave markers. And this marker looks like an old Greek building, just the remains of it, but it's actually a grave marker. Now this is a 1939 interpretation of a classical building. This is Walter Chrysler's Mausoleum in New York. And I hear that he's turned over in his vault a few times lately. This is for a mausoleum for a standard OLVP, also in New York, and it has the same classical elements, the columns, the Greek crosses. Then we get into Gothic Revival, and Gothic Revival is easy to identify. Usually they have these pointed arches. Some have temple configurations with the pointed arch, and then sometimes they have inset elements like the figure there, or the cross, the Gothic cross here. These are high-style Gothic, and they have typical architectural elements. They have a quatrefoil, these grand spires, the flying buttresses, and the cross nave. This is a Gothic-style mausoleum. You see the pointed arch doorway, the quatrefoil. Then we get to Greek Revival. This is actually more popular in buildings than in grave markers. But this has the columns on each side, the woman standing in what appears to be an entry. And then this has the typical pediment and the gable front entry. Now, Islamic and Persian style is not very often seen in the U.S., at least in eastern and southern cemeteries that I'm familiar with. Here's one of the few examples. It has the low dome, has this OG doorway shape, and then around the doorway are two different geometric designs. You can see this larger one and then the smaller one in here, and those are very typical hallmarks of the Islamic and Persian style. Then we go to modern and contemporary. Most of these are mass-produced and are just the generic monuments you see in many cemeteries. But here are some examples that were actually designed. This one on the left has an old motif of hands and flowers, but in a new contemporary style. This metal sculpture on a granite marker is a weeping woman, which is a classical element, and she's holding a willow branch, a symbol of mourning. This is an art moderne style, adapted for mausoleum. And then here's a contemporary rendering of a classical Roman villa architecture in a mausoleum. Now we get to some of my favorites, folk or vernacular. They're not predominant in any time frame except perhaps colonial, but they're more related to economic status than anything else. These are sometimes called examples of ethnicity, and that they can be, but not always. On the left is a wooden cross with a red heart. That's in a French Catholic cemetery in Quebec province. And on the right is the Pennsylvania Dutch folk heart motif. On the left is a cut hand-lettered stone that's for a free black in Antebellum, Tennessee. And then this one on the right is in the indigent section of a New York Catholic cemetery. And this is very similar to many markers, vernacular markers. It has, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it has everyday items. Like here's a piece of blue glass. There are pebbles, there are pieces of tile. Some of them have shells, just anything that happened to be at hand, and they're stuck into wet concrete that's molded into this cross frame. And both of these are in a Russian Orthodox cemetery in New York. Now they have the traditional Eastern European cross, shaped here, we'll talk more about that later, and they both have crucifixes. And here we have glass around the edges, pieces of glass, set in concrete, and then this one is painted wood. Now both of these are in a Ukrainian cemetery. On the left is metal, and on the right is terracotta surrounded with concrete, and then a metal crucifix inlaid. Now this was vernacular photo built as well. It's dated 1840 in New Hampshire. Now I still call this vernacular, but it was actually carved by an artist. He was born in Scandinavia, fell in love with an American there, came over here, and she died in childbirth. So out of mourning, he carved this for her. Face there, biblical scenes here. It's very, very unusual. Now we get into motifs and symbolism. And when we go to the graveyard this afternoon, we're going to be looking for some of these. So I'll go a little bit slower here. Now it's possible that a particular motif was chosen just because whoever was buying it liked it. And they may not have had a thought in the world about what it symbolized. Animals are fairly common. Birds and lambs are by far the most frequently seen animal images on grave markers. Doves carry a slightly different meaning than other birds, but sometimes it's hard to know whether it's a dove or some other bird. Doves connote innocence, love, purity, peace. The one on the left has something in his beak, and that's considered a soul motif. It's just what might be a leaf. Here, the bird has a bud, and he's winging heavenward. This connotes that he's flying a young, budding soul to heaven. These are on graves. This symbol is usually on graves of infants. On the left, this one is facing downward. He's plucking a rose, indicating that he's taking a beautiful soul to heaven. The bird on the right has a leaf in his beak, and that connotes that a leaf has fallen from the family tree, and the bird will be carrying that soul to heaven. And here is a huge bird, an eagle, that indicates power, military might, and in the U.S. affiliation with the government. And this is the grave for Union Civil War General George H. Thomas. Lambs are almost always associated with children's graves and indicate innocence, and in a religious context, Christ's love. The one on the right is under a willow tree, and here the motif means exactly what the inscription says, safe in the fold. Usually a lion indicates a fallen hero, courage and strength. Now we'll go to ethnicity. Sometimes ethnicity can be determined from a marker, but not always. Now some ethnic groups are so closely tied to a particular religion that determining what's ethnic and what's religion is almost impossible. We'll see some examples of that. Now on the left, this has Dutch script, so that tells you that's obviously for a Dutch person. Those are usually in cemeteries adjacent to Dutch churches. This one has a script that's Welsh, and it even tells you that the guy was from Wales. These are easy to recognize because of the double L's and the long words with few vowels. Now, in many southern cemeteries, African Americans, some former slaves, are buried in the back section on the worst ground, on the opposite side of the track, so to speak, in this case a road. Folk markers are often found on African American graves, and this inset is one example. That's actually poured concrete, made colored to look like a brick. And this lettering is really very well done. This particular man, Shellis Lewis, not the man who's buried here, but a relative, Shellis was known in the community for making these markers for African American community members, and he got to be very, very good at it. This is a later one, nice lettering. Also, in African American cemeteries, very often there will be grave goods, items placed on the grave, such as clocks or bedstead or broken glassware. In coastal areas, very often there will be shells covering the graves of African Americans. But in the last 2, maybe 3 decades, the practice of putting such items on graves of other ethnic groups makes it a little bit harder to identify those as African American or not. The one on the left is African American. You see the hand lettering there. The stone actually looks like it was dressed, is smooth, but the lettering is crude, so that tells you obviously it's a folk marker. Now this one is another concrete cross with everyday castaway items, tiles, shells, pebbles. Looks like there may have been photos inset there at one time. My guess is that this is a Hispanic marker. It's in that same indigent section of the Catholic cemetery where there are Hispanic and Eastern European names. But of the names I saw, all of the Eastern European ones were on wooden or metal markers. The Hispanic markers were all on concrete. These are both from different graveyards in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Now on the left, you see German script. On the right, says St. Petersburg, Russia. But this is not a Russian cemetery. So I just want to point out here that you can't always tell whether a particular grave marker indicates ethnicity. While it says born in Russia, the cemetery is Moravian. And the style of this marker is Moravian. In their graveyard, they're all ledger stones. All the same size, pretty much. No decoration at all. The women are buried in one section, the men in another, and the children in another. It didn't matter whether they were married. On the left, this marker has French script. This is in a Catholic cemetery in Massachusetts. About half the markers have French inscriptions. Now on the right, these markers also have French script, even though you can't really read it. They're in the older European style marker, and they're in a Catholic cemetery in Quebec province. Now here's another conundrum. On the right is this beautiful sculpture. It's an Italian grave marker. To look at that, about all you can tell is, yes, it's an Italian person, but how much of that is Italian ethnicity and how much of it is religion? To my way of thinking, most of that is religious. So you can't really look at that without the name and know that an Italian person was buried there. However, on the left, it's a little bit different story. In this particular cemetery in Barry, Vermont, many of the markers in the Italian section there have busts of the male head of household. I don't remember any busts in the rest of the cemetery. So to my way of thinking, that's a characteristic of Italian ethnicity. This is a corner of a Ukrainian cemetery, and it's modern, but if you'll note, there's interpretations of conventional iconography common to many religions. You see the gates of heaven there, you see the figure of Christ, the Last Supper, and the cross. But there are some differences here. There's a lot of use of color, and that's unusual in a religious cemetery. Also, you see wheat here, but it's not sheets of wheat like we're accustomed to seeing. These are upright. And here's a closer up view of that marker. In Ukrainian ethnicity, the Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe. So this upright wheat signifies their ethnicity. And also, because it's upright, it symbolizes their ability to thrive in their new country. This figure in the center is called a trizub, and that's a national symbol for Ukraine. It means trident. It's the most common motif on Ukrainian markers. And then this is the Eastern cross. This particular one, this type arm, is called the St. Nicholas Cross, and that's the name of this cemetery. Now, photos in glass or on ceramic are most often seen on the Eastern European markers. So we'll talk about that when we get to the cemetery. That's not always true. Now, both of these were taken in a Polish cemetery in Pennsylvania. And here, none of the burials are back to back. That's the only cemetery where I've ever seen that. So I am assuming, for the moment anyway, that that is a Polish characteristic. I may be wrong. This cemetery is like the Ukrainian one in that there's lots of color. This is tile. The woman buried here was a mathematician and also an artist. And I suspect that this one must be based on one of her paintings. This is the only obvious Chinese marker in this particular cemetery. The alphabetical character at the top is the Chinese symbol for the surname Yi, and this style is a gate. And that's an important symbol in Chinese culture. Gates are built and located according to the principles of feng shui. And both of these are for Jewish people. Typically, their markers have very little decoration. Very often, there will be a Star of David. Here, the lamp. And you'll notice pebbles on top, pebbles here. That's a Jewish tradition. Visitors leave those pebbles as a sign that the deceased has not been forgotten. They're visiting the grave. Now we go to figures and body parts. Some of the earliest markers in New England have skulls, some with crossbones. In Puritan times, death was considered an event to prepare for, not a time to memorialize the deceased. They took a very hard and harsh practical view of death as just a dust concept. The top marker also has an hourglass indicating that time has run out. This bottom marker has a shell indicating that the spirit has passed to the other side. Now, skulls and crossbones evolved into faces, some winged and some not. The wings indicate flight of the soul. This is called a winged skull. Figures are sometimes hard to make out. These are cherubs. See, they're winged. They're standing on orbs that represent the earth. bottom, we have these figures who are trumpeting. They're called imps. And they, in ancient lore, were figures that carried out tasks of death. They would sometimes carry the pall. Now this figure is a human figure called an effigy. It indicates that the soul is flying heavenward. Here, this woman is reading a book beneath two evergreen trees that symbolizes that she has everlasting life in her new heavenly home. Here you see a flying figure. This figure is going toward the clouds, heaven. And here you have a sleeping child that symbolizes a sleeping Jesus at peace, eternal slumber. This one, the little angel is holding a lamb, indicating an innocent child. And then here, the little angel is holding hands together as though holding a tiny soul. And both of these indicate flight of the soul to heaven. Now on the left is a hand palm out with the index finger pointing up, indicating gone to heaven, risen, gone home. On the right, palm out, index finger up. Now there's no general consensus that one hand means anything different than the other. This one, the backside out, again, no consensus that means anything different than if the palm is out. Here you see the finger pointing down. That doesn't mean gone below. What it does mean is the hand of God reaching down to take the soul. Another interpretation is that it means the person named below is in the ground. Here, if you notice these hands, the cuffs are alike. I take this to mean the hands as in death, that the person is at peace. Here you have hands, a woman's hand pointing down toward a man's hand. If you notice, she died first. So the interpretation here is that she's reaching down from heaven to pull his soul up. And this can vary depending, you have to really look at the cuffs to interpret this. Handshakes can mean goodbye or friendship. And here, this is a hand clasp rather than a shake. And this normally means united forever, usually from a married couple. This heart is topped with a crown and a cross, and that indicates broken. That represents Jesus and eternal life. If you see hearts intertwined, that usually means married love forever. This one is, on the right, it's kind of hard to see. Here's an eye. This is fraternal. Within this sunburst is a hand, palm holding a heart. That's also fraternal. And we'll go to fraternal. Masons in particular can be a talk all by themselves, so we're not going to go into great depth on this. These are independent order of odd fellows. The three chains, the crooks, usually they're the letters F, L, and T for faith, love, and truth are in here. Here's the all-seeing eye of God. That indicates that the organization is under God's eye, and he's watching what they do. The handshake is fraternal. The broken link indicates that the brotherhood has been broken. This is a husband-wife marker, both IOOF. The woman's organization is called the Rebecca's, and their symbol is this moon and 7 stars. This is Masonic, the most frequently seen motif, the compasses and square, and then the other tools. The G here, you'll sometimes see in the interstices, that stands for God and geometry. Wanted to point out this star. At first glance, some people thought this was a Star of David. It's not. It's Masonic. You see the little Christ figure here and then the sunburst. That has meaning within the Masonic organization. And then these are just some other Masonic symbols. And some more. I have an article in the current Association of Gravestone Studies quarterly about this, if you want to read more about it. The Shriner's motif. This is a Mason who's achieved the 33rd degree. I've also seen that with the 32nd. This is the Eastern Star. Usually the letters F-A-T-A-L are inside that, standing for fairest among thousands, altogether lovely. Here I want you to notice the PRCU. That stands for Polish Roman Catholic Union of America. That's a Polish fraternal organization that provided insurance, death benefits, and cared for widows and orphans. And these should look real familiar to people around here. Women of the World. That's a symbol for the men's organization, and this is the symbol for the women's. Military symbolism is usually pretty obvious. These are government-issued Civil War markers, so Confederate on the left and Union on the right. Usually when you see a flag, it has military significance. Grand Army of the Republic markers, little metal markers, are usually one of these two styles. And then there's a ground in front of the marker usually. The crossed swords behind the Bible indicate a chaplain. These have sabers, bugle, shield, crossed rifles, the flag draped, the canteen, all kinds of motifs here related to military. These torches are down, indicating that life is extinguished. World War I markers very often will say where somebody died, such as France, World War I. This metal stake is at the foot of a marker that has no identification on it. I think at one time it probably was, but this does have the man's name. His unit was 42nd Rainbow Division, and it gives the company and regiment information there. Then we go to geometric. These are just the most common ones. The chain, the broken link, obviously the circle's been broken. Very often German markers will have geometric design. Oops. This sunburst, it's hard to tell whether it's a sun rising or a sun setting. There's a slightly different interpretation of each of those. That's on the handout. Now, if the book is intended to be a Bible, it will usually say so. Here, the Holy Bible is inscribed. This one has a lamp in front of an open book, surrounded by a wreath. The lamp represents truth, wisdom, God's word illuminated. The flame indicates everlasting life. A book usually means the book of life. If it's not labeled Holy Bible, it could also indicate that the person was a teacher or a scholar or a preacher. And here's the tree stump now. This one is a book of life. The deceased people's names are inscribed on that book. The anchor is rarely for a sailor. It usually has religious symbolisms, meaning steadfast faith in Christ. This is on an Egyptian revival style. This detail from the door is called a palmette or an Athenian. It's simply decorative. This is a winged sun disk. It's an ancient Egyptian motif. Symbolizes the life-giving power of the sun and the spiritual attributes of the heaven indicated by the moons. Now sometimes it's hard to tell if the element on top is a lamp or an urn. And you can see here, that looks sort of like a swirl. Those are flames. Here is a classical lamp design. The urn represents the soul departing, undying friendship, or eternal vigilance. Urns usually have two handles, but when they are lit urns like this, they normally don't have handles. Lamps signify wisdom, truth, God's word illuminated. Spheres like this represent the earthly body. Another interpretation is oneness with the universe. Drapery or a shroud indicates mourning, closing the veil or curtain white. Small chair is for a child's burial. A large chair like this one can indicate that the person was an avid reader or a scholar. Coats of arms simply indicate status and occupational motifs are more frequently seen on modern markers than historic ones. The left one is one of the few historic, that's a new old post at the end of the stairway. Probably indicates that this person was a carpenter. The book here with the bookmark indicates the person was a writer, a teacher, or a scholar. This is for a preacher. Notice it looks just like a pulpit. You've got the open Bible, and then you have a crown. This is for an artist palette and brushes, and then on the right, a deep sea diver with a helmet down at the base. And this one's for a lawyer who's also a bagpiper. I suspect he earned money being a lawyer, not a bagpiper. A fireman and a logger. And religious symbolism can get pretty detailed, and we're going to skim the surface. Winged faces are called winged souls. That symbolizes the journey of the dead soul into heaven. The angel here is trumpeting. These are clouds. That symbolizes Gabriel waking the deceased for Judgment Day. And this one is holding a cross indicating eternal life through Christ. These represent the pearly gates of heaven. This cross has the letters IHS. The most common belief is that they refer to Latin phrases that mean, in this sign, the cross of Christ is my hope, or by this sign you will conquer. Some church cemeteries don't really have obvious religious imagery. The one on the left is in a Quaker cemetery. I think maybe this cemetery covered like 5 acres. Probably half a dozen markers had carving, other than name, date. If you notice here, they use 3rd month instead of March, 10th month instead of October. This one is in the Moravian cemetery I mentioned earlier. This is in a Russian Orthodox cemetery. This Eastern cross represents the cross of Christ. This is a footrest where his feet were. The top short marker indicates the inscription that was over his head. The angel here on the left has a wreath and then a crown that's propped. That indicates that the deceased is laying down his crown and the angel's getting ready, laying down his cross, and the angel's getting ready to give him a crown. And the other angel is writing the deceased's name in the book of the dead. The little angel is for a child's grave. The cross and the crown indicates trading across the earthly burdens for the heavenly reward. This cross and the crown can also be the sign. The woman clinging to the cross represents faith, and the draped cross on the right indicates the woman is mourning for the body that has left the earthly cross behind. And this bad picture on the left, I'm sorry that's so dark, that's the infant of Prague. It's a representation of baby Jesus that's based on miracles attributed to a statue in Prague, Czech Republic. The right hand is raised in a two-fingered blessing, and the other hand holds a spear that symbolizes he's master of the earth. This ringed cross has a chalice and host, some important symbol in Catholicism. It indicates communion with God, and it's usually on markers for the priest. Nativity scenes and carvings of the Holy Family are generally only on Catholic markers. Bouquets of flowers are simply a tribute to the deceased. As individual motifs, each flower can mean something different. Ferns symbolize humility, solitude, and sincerity. And on the right, the lily of the valley. Down here, it's combined with the fern. The lily of the valley symbolizes purity and innocence. On the left is a calla lily, also indicates purity and innocence. It's usually only on markers for married women, and it can also mean married love. This foliage is without the flower, indicating sorrow. The beloved flower is gone. The rose symbolizes beauty and condolence, and a fully open rose usually will indicate that the person died in the prime of fullness of life. Rose buds are usually on children's markers, and the broken one means that the life was cut short. On the left, there are palmette leaves, sometimes thought to be stylized acanthus or lotus leaves. These are acanthus leaves. That's just an ancient decoration and symbolizes immortality. These are poppies, and that symbolizes peaceful sleep. The palm branch here below symbolizes triumph and immortality. The laurel branches here mean victory over death. Cut sheaves of wheat symbolize the divine harvest, a life fulfilled. The ivy means faithfulness and friendship, and in combination with the wheat may mean married fidelity for eternity. And weeping willows are very common motifs, with or without an urn. They mean sorrowing, mourning, and the urn is the symbol of death. The flowers, whether it's in a bouquet or a wreath or feston, whatever, simply symbolizes condolence or grief. This is a laurel wreath, symbolizes victory and immortality. It's also used to mark distinctive achievements. This is a lotus wreath. It represents purity and resurrection. Oak leaves symbolize maturity, longevity, strength, and honor. Tree stumps indicate life cut off, and felled trees indicate mature life ended. These are some of the resources that are on your handout.